The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 4th chapter.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. The tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But Jesus answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again, as it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to Jesus, "All these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only Him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So what do you think of when you hear the word wilderness? I mean, think about that for a minute. Picture it in your head. When you hear the word wilderness, where does your mind go? I mean, do you see a sprawling desert with no vegetation and no sign of water anywhere you look? Do you picture yourself in the deep, dark jungle where it's so hot and humid you can hardly breathe, and where pretty much every living thing with a mouth or legs is going to try to eat you or kill you? Does wilderness make you think of the vast, snow-covered tundra of Antarctica, where it's just you and the penguins and bone-chilling winds? I mean, those places, at least to me, feel uninhabitable and utterly frightening. But I bet there are some people who hear the word wilderness and think, sign me up. They picture it as the place with the exotic safari ride, or the challenging trail that needs hiked, or the deepest parts of the seas that you can scuba dive to, or the record-setting mountain that needs scaled. I mean, setting up a tent completely off the grid with no signs of humans or civilizations for miles and miles in any direction may sound like wilderness to some, but to others that may sound like paradise. I'm guessing our ideas of wilderness may be all across the board, which is why I think we need to start by making clear what the wilderness means here. If we think of where that word wilderness comes from in Old English, they used to hear wild deerness, or the place where wild deer live, which tells of a place that is only inhabited by wild animals. Words are so cool sometimes. But then the Greek word that Matthew used for wilderness in his gospel, that points to being a place that's abandoned and lonely and desolate. The wilderness is a place of struggle. Finding yourself in the wilderness did not mean that you were on a luxury safari or vacation. It meant that you were in the depths of pain, loneliness, and vulnerability. No one wants to be in the wilderness. But that's where we find Jesus in today's story. And I would bet that the wilderness is where many of us find ourselves all too often. So that's why we start here in the wilderness at the beginning of Lent. Well, I guess really we started the season of Lent this past Wednesday on Ash Wednesday, where we gathered to recognize the fullness of our humanity, those ways we fall short, the places we could try a little harder, the sin that is in our life, the death that concludes our earthly journey. So we began there by looking at ourselves first, remembering who we are, and now we start to look around at the brokenness that's around us, the brokenness of this world that reminds us of why we are also broken. And that's all kind of weird, right? Because that's completely opposite of how Jesus got here to the wilderness. Like I said, we begin on Ash Wednesday where we're told how horrible we are, or not that bad, something like that, but that's not the takeaway. But does anyone recall what happens to Jesus just before his time in the wilderness? Do you remember how he gets there? At the very end of Matthew chapter 3, Jesus is baptized, right? He's baptized by John, and the very last line of that chapter says, "And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased.'" That's where chapter 3 ends, with God telling Jesus that he is God's Son and God is well pleased with him. And then the very next line we hear says, "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." I think sometimes we miss that interlude between Jesus' baptism and what happens right after the temptation story, which is where he begins his public ministry. We sometimes forget that Jesus was not sent into his life of ministry straight from the waters of baptism, straight from hearing God's voice say that God is pleased with Jesus. No, Jesus was first led into the wilderness, by the Spirit of God, no less, in order to be ready to begin his ministry. Apparently, before starting his ministry, Jesus must first experience hunger, fear, scarcity, loneliness. He must be brought to the point where the offers of the devil become more and more enticing. There is something in the wilderness that Jesus must first experience. My question in this, as it always is why? Why is experiencing the wilderness important for Jesus in order to do his ministry? But then today, when we pair this story of Jesus in the wilderness with the Genesis story we heard earlier of Adam and Eve being tempted and ultimately eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, then we really start seeing a bigger picture of how temptation has been a part of our world since the very beginning. Temptation has always been there, and that raises a lot of questions for us. But we don't have quite much time to answer all of those questions. We need to see why Jesus is being tempted before he gets into his ministry. And for me, I think we really start seeing the human side of Jesus and how even Jesus has to rely on and trust in God. In Jesus being tempted, we see that even Jesus is tempted to use his own power for himself rather than trusting in God to satisfy his need. And like I said earlier, if even Jesus is tempted by those things, it's no wonder that we are tempted also. I think the devil's offers, those temptations to Jesus, give us important questions that we can ask ourselves of who we trust. That first temptation, in the midst of being utterly famished, the devil tries to get Jesus to make himself his own food. And so I wonder, who do we trust for our nourishment? After that, we hear the devil trying to get Jesus to hurl himself off the top of the temple to see if God will protect him or not. And so I ask us, who do we trust to love and care for us? And in that last temptation, we hear the devil was tempting Jesus with obtaining glorious power over all the kingdoms if only he would worship the devil. And so I ask us, who do we trust to give our service? Who do we trust to worship? I mean, we know, and the devil certainly knows, that Jesus obviously and absolutely could have done any of those things. He's the Son of God, for Pete's sake. But Jesus knew, and Jesus shows us, that when you're in the wilderness, it is so easy to believe that you have that power to satisfy yourself, to pick yourself up, to carry yourself out of the wilderness. But in Jesus' responses, we see that when we are in the wilderness, when we are facing our temptations, our reliance needs to be on God to save us. Despite being physically weak and exhausted, Jesus finds his spiritual strength to hold fast to God. God is the one whom we are made to trust for our own nourishment and love and guidance. In this story today, we see that for Jesus, the wilderness was a place of beginnings. It is where his identity and his call were shaped. We have wilderness moments in our life. We will have times where our strength and our faith are tested to the core. We will face our more than fair share of temptations by the great tempter himself. We will find ourselves living in a land that can be isolating and downright dangerous. But what if we begin to reshape that experience we have in the wilderness for ourselves? What if we begin to set our power aside and rely on the one from whom all power comes? What if we remind ourselves where we began, whether it was in the waters of baptism or whether it was walking away with ashes on our forehead at the start of this season? If we do that, I think the distractions of the world, the temptations of the world start to fade away, and the things that are truly important come into focus, and the devil's diverting and tempting words lose all of their power. And we begin to see God's presence with us, just as God was with Jesus, with those angels caring for him. That does not mean these 40 days will be easy. That does not mean we will not fall short or we will not beg for an easy way out. But it does mean that as we're here at the beginning of our own 40 days, we are reminded that there are both devils and angels waiting for us in the wilderness. And then when we find ourselves in the wilderness, we will know who we can trust in that journey. Amen.